My daughter decided to leave me behind and move in with her cheating mom and her new rich husband, yet 8 years later, I turned up at her wedding but she announced a broken failed father like me can never make things right and shut the door on me. The next day, she called me in panic, telling me that her mom and stepdad slammed these papers in front of her and now she needs my help to pay the $50,000 she owes them. The day of my daughter's wedding wasn't supposed to feel like this. Weddings are meant to be celebrations of love, hope, and family. But as I stood outside the grand venue, clutching the gift I had bought with my last paycheck, I felt none of those things. I wasn't invited. She had made that abundantly clear when the invitations were sent out months ago. But I thought maybe seeing me there might make her feel something. The venue was dazzling. Luxury cars lined the parking lot and the manicured gardens looked straight out of a movie set. I stayed on the edge of the crowd, keeping my distance from the formally dressed guests who chatted and laughed as they entered. I wasn't dressed for the occasion. My suit was years old, worn only on rare formal occasions, but I had pressed it as neatly as I could. Even though I wasn't a part of her life anymore, I just wanted to see her happy, perhaps even catch a glimpse of her smile. I didn't enter the venue. I waited outside. When the moment came, I saw her step into the hallway. My heart ached. She was beautiful, radiant even, in her gown, walking arm in arm with her mother's second husband. The man looked every bit the part of the proud father, beaming as they made their way towards the grand entrance. That should have been me. But instead, I stood in the background, invisible to everyone except one person. Her. Her eyes met mine for a split second and her smile vanished. She stopped, turned on her heel, and marched towards me with anger radiating from every step. My heart sank. I opened my mouth to explain, but she didn't give me the chance. Her voice, cold and filled with contempt, carried over the of the crowd. She said I had no right to be here, that I broke and failed. Father, like me, didn't belong at her wedding. I tried to speak to tell her I just wanted to see her on her big day, but she cut me off telling me to leave before I embarrassed her further. Then, as if to drive the knife deeper, she turned her back on me and made her grand entrance while smiling at her stepfather and the door slammed shut as she walked in. I stood there for a moment, stunned. Everybody heard what she said. I turned and walked away, clutching the gift that would never reach her hands. My footsteps felt heavy as I left the venue, her words replaying in my head over and over again. Broke, failed, no place in her life. When I got home that evening, the small apartment felt emptier than usual. I sat on the worn couch, staring at the box wrapped in simple paper that now seemed utterly pointless. I had saved for months to buy her something nice, something meaningful, a bracelet engraved with the words "Always your dad." But maybe I was fooling myself. It wasn't supposed to be like this. 8 years ago, when her mother and I divorced, I thought we could still be a family in some way. I didn't expect it to be easy, but I believed our bond would survive. She was 14 then, just starting high school. I remember sitting her down explaining that I would always be there for her no matter what. She didn't cry. She just asked if she could live with her mom. I didn't blame her at first. Her mother's new husband was everything I wasn't: wealthy, successful, and able to provide a life I simply couldn't. They moved into a large house in an affluent neighborhood, while I struggled to afford a 2-bedroom apartment on the other side of town. I worked long hours at a job that barely paid the bills, and I knew it showed. I was tired, stressed, and sometimes bitter, but I still tried. I showed up to her school events even when I wasn't invited. I sent her texts and called her regularly, even though most of them went unanswered. On her 16th birthday, I bought her a pair of earrings that she'd wanted for months. When I handed them to her, she barely looked at me before saying her stepdad had already bought her something better. That was the beginning of the end. Over time, her responses became colder, more distant, until eventually they stopped altogether. She didn't come to visit me anymore, even on holidays. Last time I saw her before the wedding was at her high school graduation. I wasn't invited to the ceremony, but I managed to catch her outside afterwards. I wanted to tell her how proud I was, but she barely acknowledged me before walking away with her mom and stepdad. The years that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I worked 2 jobs at one point, trying to dig myself out of depression. I had no family left except for her, and yet she had chosen to leave me behind. I spent countless nights wondering where I had gone wrong, replaying every argument and moment of weakness, convincing myself that if I had been stronger, wealthier, or better, she might have stayed. And yet, I never stopped hoping. Every birthday, every holiday, I waited for a call that never came. I told myself that one day, she would see that I loved her more than anyone else ever could. That's why I went to the wedding, even though I knew I wasn't welcome. I thought maybe for just one moment, she might see me and remember the father who used to tuck her in at night and tell her bedtime stories. But now, sitting in the quiet of my apartment, her words ringing in my ears, I realized how foolish I had been. She had made her choice a long time ago. I wasn't her father anymore, not in the way that mattered to her. I placed the unopened gift on the table and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The pain was unbearable, but I knew I would survive it. After all, I had been surviving it for years. The morning after the wedding, I woke up with a weight on my chest that felt almost physical. I barely slept, haunted by the memory of my daughter's furious words and the way the door slammed shut in my face. Her voice echoed in my mind, calling me a broke and failed father, making it clear I didn't belong in her life. I made my coffee and tried to distract myself with the morning news, but it was impossible to focus. My phone buzzed, interrupting my thoughts, and when I glanced at the screen and saw her name, my heart stopped. For a moment, I just stared at the phone, unsure if I even wanted to answer. After years of silence, after the humiliation of the previous day, what could she possibly have to say? Against my better judgment, I picked up. Her voice hit me like a slap, panicked, trembling, and starkly different from the cruel tone she used at the wedding. She didn't waste a second with pleasantries. She said her mother and stepfather had confronted her after the wedding and handed her a stack of documents. The documents detailed every single expense from the wedding venue, catering, flowers, dress, everything, and totaled $50,000. Now they were demanding that she repay them in full. She said they weren't interested in partial payments or any sort of negotiation. If she didn't repay the full amount soon, they were prepared to take legal action. She sounded desperate, confused, and completely blindsided. I leaned back in my chair, gripping the phone tightly as anger bubbled up inside me. The same people she had chosen over me, the ones who had replaced me in her life, were now turning on her when she needed them most. And now, after everything, she was turning to me. I didn't even try to hide the disbelief in my voice. I asked her why she thought I could help. Just yesterday, she'd made it clear that I was a failure, a man who had no place in her life. Her voice cracked as she admitted that she hadn't known what she was saying, that she was overwhelmed. She said she hadn't meant it, but I could hear the hesitation in her words. I told her that she could ask her husband for that money. She explained that she had told her husband from the beginning not to worry about wedding expenses because her mother and stepfather would handle everything. Now she couldn't go back on her word. She admitted that she'd assured him they wouldn't have to spend a dime because her parents were generous enough to cover all the costs. I asked her why were they behaving in such a way. I didn't understand. I thought she had a good relationship with them. Her tone grew bitter as she recounted how her mother had initially opposed her marriage. Her mother thought her husband wasn't good enough, that he wasn't rich enough to provide the kind of life they expected for her. For months, they fought over it, but she had believed her mother had finally come around and accepted them. Now it was clear that acceptance came with strings attached. She said they didn't have any student loans. They had been lucky in that regard, but they were newlyweds. They were trying to save money to start a family, and the idea of throwing away $50,000 was unimaginable even if they had it, which they don't. She tried to make me understand how much they were counting on building a secure future for themselves and their future children, my grandkids. I felt my stomach twist as she used the word grandkids as if that was supposed to soften me. I couldn't help but think about how little she had cared about my place in her life until now. I reminded her of the things she'd said to me at the wedding, of the way she'd humiliated me in front of everyone. I asked her if she still thought I was a broken, failed father who could never make things right. Her silence spoke volumes. After a moment, she stammered out an apology. She said she hadn't meant it, that she'd been angry and overwhelmed. She begged me to understand that she hadn't really thought about what she was saying, that it wasn't true, and she said she was calling me now because she had nowhere else to turn to. Her words hit me hard. I wanted to hang up, to tell her that this was her problem to solve. But the part of me that had always loved her, that had tried so hard to stay in her life, wouldn't let me. I asked her why she didn't go to her husband for help. Surely, if they were planning to start a family, they could find a way to handle this together. She said he didn't have that kind of money, and she couldn't bear to put this on him after everything they'd been through. Her voice cracked again as she started crying, and she said she didn't know what else to do. She said she knew she had hurt me, that she had made mistakes, but she needed my help. And she begged me, saying she didn't want to ruin her marriage over this. She said she had been naive, trusting her mother and stepfather, thinking they had accepted her, and now she was paying the price. Hearing her cry brought back memories I hadn't thought about in years. I remembered the little girl who used to run to me with scraped knees, who trusted me to make everything better, but that girl was gone, replaced by someone who had pushed me away time and time again. I told her flatly that I didn't have that kind of money, and I reminded her of the life I had been living alone in a tiny apartment, barely able to save much. I told her I didn't have $50,000 lying around to bail her out. She sobbed into the phone, begging me to reconsider. She said she knew I didn't have much, but anything would help. She said she'd pay me back and that she'd do whatever it took to make this right, and I told her I would think about it. My tone was calm, but inside I was anything but. Part of me hated myself for even considering it after everything she had put me through. After all the pain and humiliation, did I really owe her anything? Before she could respond, I ended the call and I sat there in the silence that followed, her pleas still ringing in my ears. My heart was heavy with the weight of a decision I didn't know how to make. What should I do? Update 1. After I hung up the phone that day, I felt exhausted. I sat back in my chair, staring out the window as her words played on repeat in my mind. For years, I dreamed of hearing her voice again, but not like this. Not filled with desperation and panic, but with the warmth and love I remembered from when she was younger. Yet, here we were. I tried to push the thoughts away, but they clung to me, demanding to be acknowledged. The truth was, I had spent the past 8 years trying to move on, trying to heal from the pain of her choosing her mother over me. When the divorce happened, I knew things wouldn't be easy, but I had never imagined she'd cut me out so completely. For years, I blamed myself, and I asked myself if I could have done more if I had failed her somehow. I thought about the arguments her mother and I used to have, the bitterness that filled our home long before the divorce. I wondered if she had absorbed all of that negativity, if she had internalized the way her mother spoke about me and let it color her view of me. But as time went on, I began to see things differently. I realized that I had done the best I could with what I had. I wasn't perfect, but I had always loved her and tried to provide for her, even when money was tight. I was the one who stayed up late, helping her with school projects, and who drove her to soccer practice when I could, and who made sure she had everything she needed. When the divorce happened, I fought for custody. I wanted her to stay with me, but the courts favored her mother. Her mother's new husband with his flashy car and big house made me look like a joke in comparison. I couldn't compete with that, and I knew it. When she chose to move in with them, it broke something inside me. I spent weeks trying to understand it, trying to accept it. I told myself that she was just a kid, and she didn't know what she was doing, but the pain didn't go away. And when she stopped returning my calls, when she stopped visiting altogether, I realized that I had truly lost her. It took me years to pick myself up from that. At first, I threw myself into work, taking on extra shifts and side jobs just to keep myself busy. I moved into a smaller apartment to save money, cutting back on everything that wasn't absolutely necessary. Slowly but surely, I built a stable life for myself, but it wasn't glamorous enough for her. More importantly, I started to heal emotionally. I tried to let go of the guilt and the self-blame. I told myself I couldn't control what she chose to believe or who she chose to be. I had done my best from my end, and that was all I could do. But now, hearing her voice again, all of those old wounds felt fresh and raw. I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said at the wedding, how she'd called me a broken, failed father in front of everyone. I had specifically asked the staff to let me wait right outside. I just wanted to congratulate her. The humiliation of that moment was still fresh in my mind, and yet here she was, asking me for help. I tried to remind myself that she was desperate, that she didn't know where else to turn, but part of me couldn't help but feel bitter. She hadn't cared about me or my struggles for the past 8 years, and I wasn't asking her to. All I wanted was to spend some time with her, and now she expected me to fix her problems. I thought about the $50,000 her mother and stepfather were demanding. It was an obscene amount of money, far more than I had ever seen at one time. Even if I wanted to help, I couldn't. My savings account barely covered a few months of expenses, let alone anything close to that amount. And then there was the question of whether I even should help. Wasn't this her mess to clean up? She had chosen her mother and stepfather over me. She had trusted them to take care of everything, and now she was facing the consequences of that choice. Maybe it was time for her to learn a hard lesson about who really had her best interests at heart. But then a small voice in the back of my mind whispered, "What kind of father lets his daughter suffer?" The question gnawed at me, filling me with a deep sense of doubt. I had always prided myself on being there for her, no matter what. Even after she left, I tried to stay in her life, to be a source of support. Was I really ready to turn my back on her now when she needed me most? At the same time, I couldn't ignore the years of rejection and pain she had put me through. I thought about all the times I had reached out to her, only to be met with silence. I thought about the way she had looked at me at the wedding like I was nothing more than an embarrassment. I found myself wondering if this was really about her or if it was about me. Was I hesitating because I wanted to teach her a lesson or because I wanted to protect myself from being hurt again? The truth was, I didn't know. I felt like I was standing at a crossroads and no matter which path I chose, I would regret it. As the week went on, I found myself replaying our conversation in my head. I thought about the way her voice had cracked when she says she didn't know what else to do. I thought about the tears I could hear in her voice, the raw vulnerability she hadn't shown me in years. I tried to imagine what it must have felt like for her, realizing that the people she had trusted to support her were now turning on her. I thought about the weight of that $50,000 hanging over her head, about the fear and uncertainty she must be feeling. And then I thought about her husband, the man her mother had deemed unworthy because he wasn't rich enough. I wondered what kind of pressure this was putting on their new marriage and how they were supposed to start their lives together with such a massive debt hanging over them. By the time the sun started to set, I still didn't have an answer. All I knew was that I couldn't ignore her call for help. Whether I decided to help her or not, I owed it to both of us to make that decision carefully. I wanted to help her deal with her problem, not because I was being asked to fix her problems, but because I was being given a chance to show her the kind of man I really was. Update 2. It's been a few weeks now since I last heard from her. The phone call and the desperation in her voice was still fresh in my mind. I was left with more questions than answers. She had told me everything about what happened after the wedding. Her mother and stepfather had come at her with those documents demanding $50,000 for the wedding expenses. I could barely contain my anger when she first said it. It felt like betrayal all over again, but it was the first time in years I had heard such raw panic in her voice, the kind of panic that made me wonder if I was just letting her get away with everything. But now, the situation seemed different. Her mother had always been manipulative, but the stepfather was a different breed. He wasn't the charming man I used to think he was. If anything, he was just a figurehead in their empire of wealth and privilege, standing by while her mother did the dirty work. It wasn't hard to figure out what was going on. My daughter had grown up with that image of success in her mind, and now for the first time, she was seeing its price. I hadn't decided yet what I was going to do, but it was time to face them. So I set up a meeting. It wasn't something I looked forward to, but I had to do it. I needed to understand exactly how deep the hole was that they dug for her. If there was any way to help her out, I had to know. As I walked up the grand steps to their mansion, I had to force myself to remain calm. The house was imposing and pristine. Her mother was the same too, sharp, cold, always calculating. Her stepfather, on the other hand, was quiet, watching from the sidelines like always. When we sat down in their luxurious living room, the tension was palpable. The mother wasted no time. She started off with a tone that had no room for empathy, saying that my daughter had agreed to the terms. She was an adult now and needed to learn responsibility. There was no pity in her words, no softness, just a cold reminder that my daughter had signed the documents. She had to face the consequences of her actions, she said, as though it was some grand lesson in life. Her stepfather didn't say much at first. He sat back in his chair, arms crossed, avoiding eye contact, but his presence was as imposing as ever. I couldn't help but wonder what he was really thinking. He'd known her since she was a child. Did he have any compassion left for her? Or was he just playing the part of a husband afraid of angering her mother? It wasn't until I asked exactly what were the terms of the documents that things started to get interesting. They hadn't told me anything about that detail, and I wanted to know how far they'd really gone. I turned to her stepfather, trying to keep my voice steady as I asked about the agreement. His response was as expected, vague and dismissive. He said it was just a formality, a way of making sure everything was handled properly, a basic loan agreement, but I wasn't buying it. There was something more to this, something that didn't sit right with me. It was my daughter, though, who started to crack under the pressure. She was quiet at first, but as the conversation wore on, she began to defend herself. She blamed me for not being better when she was growing up. She said I wasn't there for her when it mattered, that I had failed her. I could hear the anger in her words, but there was also something else, a deep hurt, like she was trying to convince herself that I was the problem, not her choices. I didn't get angry though. I kept my voice calm as I told her that what she had done to herself wasn't just a result of me not being there, that she had chosen to cut me out of her life. She had signed that agreement. Did she really think they would just forgive her debt after that? She had never mentioned it to me. I didn't know what she expected, but it wasn't the kind of debt that just disappears because she was caught off guard. Her face fell when I said that. It wasn't the reaction I'd expected, but I could see the shame in her eyes. She was like a wounded dog. Still, she wasn't ready to let go of the idea that she was a victim. Her mother, of course, jumped in saying I was just trying to play the hero. She didn't like me questioning their methods, but the truth was I wasn't buying into their act anymore. I wasn't going to let them pull the strings and control everything. My daughter needed to understand that. I couldn't stand it anymore, so I pulled the stepfather aside, away from the conversation. I knew this was the only chance to get through to him. I asked him directly, wasn't there any compassion left for my daughter? He had watched her grow up. Surely that meant something. He sighed deeply as though he was wrestling with something inside him. He told me that he didn't want to do this, but he also didn't want to upset his wife. That was his only excuse. I couldn't believe it. He was more afraid of her than he was of doing the right thing. He confessed that her mother had been crying about the wedding for days. She was still angry about my daughter's choice of husband, and it was tearing her apart. In the end, my daughter had to pay for all of it. I couldn't even fathom the emotional manipulation at play, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I kept my tone neutral, trying to make him see reason. I told him that we could work something out. I asked him if he could agree to let my daughter pay the debt in installments. Surely, that was reasonable. He didn't like that idea, and we negotiated. I tried to get it to be a monthly installment, but he was adamant that there had to be a payment every week or her mother would lose it completely. I didn't like it, but I could see no other way out. I reluctantly agreed. Every week it would be tough, but at least it was something manageable. Walking away from their mansion was harder than I'd expected. I couldn't shake the feeling I hadn't done enough, but I had done all I could. My daughter was an adult now. I had to let her make her own choices even if it meant accepting the consequences of those choices. As I stepped out of the mansion, I realized that no matter how much I wanted to protect her, there was nothing I could do to fix everything. My daughter had to face her own reality, and maybe she would learn from it. Update 3. A month had passed since the confrontation at her mother's mansion. Things had settled down, at least on the surface. I'd gone back to my usual routine, focusing on my work and trying to put the whole situation behind me, but the weight of it lingered, especially the sense that my daughter still hadn't truly understood everything. I hadn't heard much from her in the weeks following our meeting, and part of me thought that maybe this would be the end of it, that she would just go back to living the life she had always known, and I'd stay out of it. But when I got the call, I knew something had changed. She sounded different. There was no panic, no defensiveness, just a quiet, almost hesitant tone. She asked if we could meet. I agreed. When she showed up at the small cafe I picked, she looked like someone who had finally woken up from a long sleep. Her posture was more relaxed, and there was a calmness in her eyes that wasn't there before. She apologized, not in a rushed, forced way, but with real emotion. She admitted that she'd been blind to everything, so my efforts to the love I had always given her. She said that in her pursuit of comfort and approval from her mother and stepfather, she had let their wealth overshadow the one thing that truly mattered, my love and my sacrifice for her. She said she didn't realize how much she had taken for granted until everything blew up. It wasn't easy to hear, but there was something about her honesty that hit me hard. This was the first time in years that I felt like I wasn't invisible in her life. I didn't know what to say at first. Part of me wanted to tell her it was all okay, to let it go and move on, but I knew better. She needed to understand the boundaries I had set, boundaries that were for both of our growth. So I told her I would help, but it wouldn't be in the way she expected. I would support her emotionally and give advice when she needed it, but I wasn't going to just hand her money. She needed to stand on her own 2 feet, just like I had. As I spoke, I saw a flicker of understanding in her eyes. She didn't argue, didn't try to push me to do more than I was willing. It was enough for now. We had a coffee. I handed the wedding gift to her, and I told her she could sell it for a couple of thousand at least. She looked guilty, but said nothing except a meek thank you. After a while, she stood up to leave, but before she walked out, she turned around and gave me a smile, one that was real this time.